In February this year, Hollie Gazzard was stabbed to death by her boyfriend.
I'm still struggling a lot with Hollie's death. I don't think you'll ever come to terms with it. You'll learn to live with it. But day-to-day's hard. I miss her terribly.
She'd suffered months of physical and psychological abuse.
Started off okay, but then towards the end, we saw the signs that the relationship wasn't going right. It did get to a stage whereby we were concerned, but we never knew the extent of what abuse Hollie was facing.
You do feel guilty for anything, because you always think there's something I could have done, or I wish there's something I could have done, but at the time, you're not aware of it.
Sadly, Hollie's story is not uncommon. Did you recognise that your behaviour was controlling?
I did. I knew that it was wrong what I was doing.
Across the country, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men suffer abuse at the hands of a partner. This couple's experience began with prolonged psychological abuse and culminated in a severe beating. What can you remember from that night as well?
Well, the scene had been set earlier on in the day, so I knew when he came home it was not going to be good. So he came home and I said, I think you better go. He saw this as why are you trying to get rid of me? The more I asked him to leave, the worse the situation got. That's when it happened. He punched me, and obviously that one punch changed our life forever.
Can you remember doing that and what you felt in that moment?
I can remember, it clearly, but to say what I felt at that precise moment, I didn't think of anything else. I was just in such a rage. I didn't even think about her being pregnant. I just erupted.
Since August last year, 3 women have been killed by their partners in Gloucestershire: Jane Wiggett, Kayleigh Palmer and Hollie Gazzard. And back in March, a national report found Gloucestershire Police was failing domestic abuse victims, and it was one of the 4 worst performing forces in the country. So why has domestic abuse still not been tackled successfully?
We've seen a 20% or more decrease in police numbers. And we know from the figures, from the research, that if you have really good support services for women experiencing domestic abuse, you can actually get safety for a considerable number of those women. I think that kind of whole framework has begun to disintegrate with the austerity measures from the government. Cuts are having an impact.
Could more have been done? Could there be more resources? Of course the answer has to be yes. Would that have prevented the deaths?
Gloucestershire Police Force was reassessed in June and found to have made huge improvements, thanks in part to a programme of training in conjunction with charities and social services.
Obviously there have been the 3 cases of domestic homicide. Would more resources have helped?
That's a bit of a loaded question, isn't it? Of course, the more people you have, the more things that you can do, but it's not just about resources. It's about understanding what your problem is, making sure that you're able to do something about that problem in a targeted and informative way. That's what's important.
And do you think that the force in Gloucestershire do understand domestic abuse?
The important thing for me is that it's on the lips of our officers and our police family. Everybody needs to be talking about it and understanding that we don't tolerate it. The messaging and understanding throughout the organisation is important.
To help officers recognise domestic abuse before it's too late, they're trying out a brand new approach.
Tell me about the toolkit that you've developed. How does it work?
Well, it's a reference tool really, and it's to raise awareness of what domestic abuse looks like, because everybody can perhaps recognise somebody being punched in the face as domestic abuse. Not everybody will recognise coercive control, and not everybody will know the high risk factors, and it's only afterwards, looking back, they'll say, well, if only we'd known. But we do know a lot of the high risk factors, and I think the police wanted to raise awareness of those kinds of issues.
I wanted to find out if this toolkit could potentially save lives, so I went to see what Hollie's family thought of the idea.
Oh, hi Rachel.
Hi,
Come on in.
Nice to see you. Thanks. Is there anything on there that you think Hollie might have answered yes to, and it might have been a useful question for the police to have been able to ask her?
Does this person put their hands around your throat? Obviously we found out with Hollie that on 2 occasions that had happened, and that's a very high risk.
Nick, what about yourself, looking at that list?
Yeah, there's quite a few there, what's Chloe said with regards to Hollie, but perhaps what I'd like to also to see in there is, because a lot of these are around physical violence, but there is a growing trend in terms of psychological violence, financial violence as well, and perhaps I'd like to see a couple of those areas covered with this toolkit.
And I suppose it must be difficult because you look back and see things now that you didn't necessarily see at the time and think, oh, I wish I could have done more, I wish there was something I could have done. Is that how you feel there is more that you could have done or wish you'd have done at the time?
I believe there is. If I would have recognised the signs of it a bit more, then yes, I would have, being the older sister, hopefully would have kind of spoke to Hollie about it and made sure that something was done about it, but that's very easy to say.
Hollie's family have now set up a trust in her name to help prevent domestic abuse.
Hi Sally, it's Nick Gazzard here from the Hollie Gazzard Trust. The trust was set up obviously following Hollie's death, and we wanted something positive to come out of the tragedy. And obviously Hollie was very young, she was only 20 when she was killed. So we want to ensure that there's a prevention strategy in Gloucestershire, or in the UK really. And we want to ensure that there are healthy relationships with teenagers. And so we're going to do some training with GDASS going into schools.
And GDASS is Gloucestershire Domestic Abuse Support Service. What I want to try and get from you is to gauge how you see domestic abuse and what you know.
Giving teenagers training on how to identify if they're not in a healthy relationship. So give them some indicators, and then if people fall out of that and they identify that they aren't in a healthy relationship, then we're also paying for 10 counsellors at GDASS to be trained, and that will deal with any of the fallout. So we've got all the links in the chain covered on the domestic abuse angle.
You're dressed for a night out, your boyfriend says your top is too revealing. He says people will think you look like a slut. He suggests you get changed.
So if that's what he's doing all the time, then it's a bit controlling, like if it's not a revealing top.
Domestic abuse is something that happens a lot. What do you think is needed to tackle it in our society?
I've been saying for a long time we need to take this into schools, we need to take this into young children. We need to teach them about how to control emotions, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable.
From your point of view and from, with perpetrators as well, what's needed?
Well, I mean, as soon as I did the course, my first thought was, why isn't a course like this at schools? It's going to take a lot to, eradicate totally, but, we've got to start.
Your date has just started making comments.
The hope for Nick is that this will become part of every school's curriculum.
Definitely, that is just so wrong.
Was there anything in particular that you found really interesting or really helpful?
Probably identifying what actually is domestic abuse, because some things you don't really think about, like financial abuse and that, you don't really think about that.
I liked the scenarios they had because we could see different examples of domestic abuse.
Do you think this is something that should be talked about more to young people like yourselves?
Yeah, I think, and even younger, so if they learn from a young age what to do, it would help them if it did happen to them in the future.
Although unfortunately Hollie's not here, actually something good is coming out of this in that now young people at this school are being taught about domestic abuse and healthy relationships.
Absolutely, and if we can actually save one person from going through what Hollie went through, then everything would have been so much worthwhile.